Okay, Dr. Martin. So, yeah, Cindy has had a pretty busy day, so I'll start with the preliminaries and Cindy can jump in to explain about certain of the nuances of what the markers are about. So the good news is that we are allowed to share the markers, which is what we would do. I'll start sharing the screen and then we can take you through competency-wise what the markers are and what do they, where have they changed a bit. In fact, we have a mapping document which we have prepared, which will shortly be on the website, probably by next week. The good news, in a sense, is that despite the way the markers have changed, which we explained in the last session as well, some of you may have been there, some of them may be new attending today, is that while from the original 11 competencies in the framework and the 9 markers that were developed sometime around 2016, we now have 8 competencies in the framework. And earlier there were 47 markers, we have now 37 markers. So it's a more, let's say, concise kind of a document. And from the original set of competency framework, 2 have been removed, powerful questioning and direct communication. They have been incorporated into what used to be called awareness, now is a new evoking awareness. And the original markers and some of the competencies which were part of awareness have been moved into the last competency, which is now called learning and growth, to refer to action. And in place of the 2 that have been removed, which makes the marker sets from 9 to 7, 1 more has been added, something called coaching mindset, which then brings the total number of the competencies as well as the marker headings to 8 of them. We personally believe, Cindy and I, and many of our trainers, and I guess most people who've been involved with it, this is a really significant shift forward by ICF for a couple of reasons. One is the coaching mindset brings in a very much needed accent and focus on the awareness of the coach or the coaches themselves, he or she, and based on which the coach is able to inspire, evoke awareness in the client. Earlier, for those of you who are quite familiar with the markers were just about client awareness. How do you create awareness? There was nothing ever said about what is required outside of the session and even inside the session, how the coach's awareness is going to be created and how the coach's awareness is going to be reflected. So it's a really major shift and we're extremely happy about it. I'm not going to go through each one of those competencies that have been outlined by ICF, which are excellent documentation, but we are going to look at the markers themselves, which is going to be far more relevant to the learners and the trainers at this point in time. And also in the competency framework, but not so much in the PCC marker framework, they're not necessarily exactly the same, because the competency framework includes stuff which happens outside of the session, whereas the PCC marker framework is specifically about how do you conduct a session and how do trainers and other SSS evaluate the performance of the coach learner. The coaching agreement expands into larger than just what is happening in the session. Of course, it does address the session, what needs to be the outcome and how will be evidence and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it also, as the framework outside of the markers, it includes things like what happens in the coaching journey, how it is conducted, what are the kind of contracts that need to happen between other stakeholders other than just the person with whom the conversation is happening. So all of you would need to be familiar with both the competencies per se. I remember in the last session, some people were calling it the text. It's not really the text. Both of them are text and documentation, if you want to look at it that way. One is called the competency framework, which includes the 8 headings, which are ethics, coaching mindset, coaching agreement, trust and safety, presence, listening, awareness, and learning and growth. And those elements in the competency framework, especially those which happen within the session, have been converted into specifically evidenceable markers, and which are called the PCC markers. So you need to be familiar with both. You need to have a broader understanding of the spirit of what the competency framework is about, and then also understand how that is going to be evidenced during the session. So that is the primary contextual difference that I want all of you to be aware of, because very often we miss the trees for the woods or the woods for the trees. In this case, you need to be familiar with both of them and be able to apply them. The second factor is that it's very easy for most people to be trained and also learn to coach by using the markers in letter and not in spirit and not in context. We call this in Coacharya as coaching the markers rather than coaching the client. And that is something which is not going to help any of the learners in the long term. It's much easier for a trainer to tell people, hey, this is what the marker is about. So if you ask this kind of a question, that is going to happen. It doesn't make any sense. And we will illustrate that by some examples later on. What needs to happen is the spirit of the markers in terms of understanding why the markers are there. In this session of roughly about 1 hour or so, we won't be able to go into depth of it, but we will give you an overview what this is about. And the third we would like to point out is that ethics, which is competency 1, and coaching mindset competency 2, these are not directly evidenced and assessed through a session recording and a transcript, which is what entitles you to the qualification for a credential or certification. It's the remaining 6, which are agreement, trust and safety, presence, listening, awareness, and learning and growth. Those 6 are the ones which are going to be the evidenceable markers or evidenceable headings of the coaching framework. And there are totally about 37. As I said, the good news is that there is not really that much of a difference, except probably just one marker, which I find it is something to do with how the coach succinctly summarizes and plays it back to the client or something of that sort. There has been some changes in the language, but by and large, these 37 markers are a faithful reproduction of what the original 47 markers were there in the earlier framework as well. So in terms of either learning or being trained or practicing, it isn't going to make really a great difference. But we do believe that the better news as far as the framework is concerned, it provides a lot more focus on this aspect of the coach's awareness. And it also very explicitly provides for the coach to be able to share what the coach intuitively feels, he or she, and to be able to help the client by partnering with the client. So there's a lot more of the word partnering. Earlier it was there in a few of the presence markers, but here you'll find that they spread all over. And Cindy would talk a little bit about what that really means. And another one is about the emphasis on emotions. Earlier, there were a couple of markers in listening primarily, and a little bit about in energy and presence. These refer to the coach noticing emotions and inquiring about them. But here you will find that is spread over many more markers. And these are very, very significant differences in terms of elevating your ability to practice as a coach from a transactional coach to a much more powerful master level transformational coach. especially elements of partnering and this aspect of emotion. They can easily bring in elements of ontology and somatics and what we call as the who questions, which make a significant difference in the way that a coach is able to add value to the client. So we truly believe that these markers are a big step forward in terms of the ICF's own evolution of defining competencies and establishing evidencing markers. Some of us have been through some of the programs with ICF in developing these markers in some ways. We understand the guidelines that have been provided in terms of assessing. So there are some subtle and not so subtle differences. One of the not so subtle differences, for example, is that there is a particular marker which now says the coach shall pause, be silent, etc. Instead of just saying not interrupting. And this means that even someone while coaching is constantly saying, the assessor is going to interpret that as interrupting. The assessor is going to interpret that as breaking the silence. So it'll be a contra evidence. So be very careful. And when it says pause, that means you count for 5 seconds, as we keep telling people, when the client speaks and finishes, before you start speaking. Don't jump in. And it has a powerful meaning. The fact that you're jumping in immediately after the client finishes, or even before the client really finishes, without allowing time for reflection for the client, means that you are working overtime in your brain on your own internal dialogue while the client is speaking, and you want to present your judgment, your bias, your thoughts across to the client, perhaps as an advice or a solution in the form of a question. Invariably, that is likely to be a leading question and a closed question. And these don't help the client. So some of these markers, you need to go more in depth to understand the ethos behind why those markers have been positioned. So I'll leave to Cindy for a few minutes now before I take up each of those markers, starting from, I would not cover ethics and coaching mindset in any great detail, but starting from agreement, I'll take them through and Cindy can comment on them as well. Cindy, do you have any comments to make at this point?
Okay. So, let us pick up. Let's talk a little bit about coaching mindset. And Ram is going to pick up on CC2. But I thought, just let's talk a little bit about it. Because there are indicators for a credentialing process of what's being looked for. There are particular behaviors that are articulated and, that show up. And there are some markers in the new PCC markers that are indicators for our coach shows up in this framework of embodies a coaching mindset. And just by mere definition, or the ICF definition, it's a mindset that's open, curious, flexible, and client-centered. And Ram spoke in depth about client-centered a few minutes ago. And also they talk about a process that requires ongoing learning and development, and that's in the background. But how does it show up in a coaching session, especially one for evaluation? Bearing in mind, PCC Markers is a body of evidencing for an evaluation process or for your performance exam. And ICF indicators around this is, if you're looking at the document, 4.1, 4.3, 4.5, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 6.1, 6.5, 7.1, and 7.5.
Cindy, I can share the screen if you would like. Shall I?
Okay. Just as a brief overview while Ram shares screen, if you look at those markers, all of them have some indicator of how the coach shows up in the coaching session, responding to what the client is saying. And you see words like coach acknowledges and respects, coach acknowledges and supports, coach partners, coach responds. That gives us a good indicator, right, of how the coach is showing up in response to what the client is saying. Or in simple words, how is this coach partnering with the client? And it talks about the whole of the client and language that's customized to what the client is using, and talks about there's quite a bit of support in those indicators, how the coach is supporting the client. Like, for example, how does the coach partner with the client by supporting the client to choose what happens in the session? And how does this coach respond to what the client wants to accomplish throughout the session? You know, after you establish this agreement for the session, then how is the coach supporting the client in what they want to accomplish throughout the session, helping the client progress on the goal or outcome they set for the session? Ram, I'll stop there because I can see you've got your screen shared on those indicators. They are the indicators, you can see it on the screen. The screen is quite small. Can you make it any bigger? If you can't,
just 1 second. Let me try and. Is that better now?
Okay, there are the indicators here, if you're wondering what I was talking about. So have a look at that, an overview of the indicators, and you'll get a good sense of what would show up in the coaching conversation for credentialing that would be an indicator of embodying the coaching mindset. And I want you to notice this if you're going for credentialing. The ICF talks about, as with other competency areas, a minimum number of these markers would need to be demonstrated to pass the PCC evaluation exam. Okay, pay attention to that. So it'll be a useful exercise if you found some time or set aside some reflection time and go through these points and make a note of it and have a real look at it, especially in context of how is this showing up in the way you are coaching clients. Okay, Ram, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Just to carry on from what you just said, just go into a little more detail in terms of the coaching mindset. You will note that there are 10 markers out there which have been put down, which are not directly evidenceable as markers of CC2 embodies a coaching mindset, but are built into the various other competency groups. 4 stands for trust and safety, 5 stands for presence, 6 stands for listening, 7 stands for awareness. They are built into those. And if you go into the details of those, we will not specifically be talking about them, but you can figure out yourself. You will find that each of these markers have something in common. They are about a kind of a partnering with a client. They are about asking who questions. They are addressing emotions, what is going on within the mind of the client. So these are the ones which arise from the deep client centricity that Cindy talked about, the unconditional positive regard, and the empathy. And they're being expressed as questions from the coach, which are specific to the context of what is happening and what is being said by the client. And the questions arise from there. So even though these elements of the coaching mindset are not directly evidenceable in the markers, but through other markers themselves, other competency markers, they would all feature in terms of the way that you conduct your coaching conversation. So for trainers, it's going to be extremely important, and for learners also to understand the skills required to present this coaching mindset in their conversations. And they would also be present in the coach knowledge assessment test. So in fact, we would be modifying the coach knowledge assessment test to include testing of these markers as well to the questions that we already have in our mock test. So I will leave this at this point in time and move on to the next one, which we believe the competency 3, which earlier used to be CC2, coaching agreement. Now it's called establishing and maintaining agreement. There's a minor change in the wording in terms of how do you maintain that agreement over a session or even through a journey. And it always starts with a clear identification what the client wants to accomplish in that session, in this session, as it says. This is the key point. And very often, the biggest difficulty that coaches have, we have seen this at MCC level, if they're not grounded well in the competency framework and the markers, is not demonstrating this adequately. For instance, let's say if the coach wants to inquire into what the client wants to do in the session or wants to talk about, and you start a conversation with, what is it that you want to happen in this session? What's on your mind? Or sometimes, what is it that you want to achieve in this session? Or what's your outcome? But the fact is, irrespective of how the coach phrases it, the client is very rarely, unless the client is another coach, he has a full idea about what the heck is going on. If you're really talking about a real client, the client is going to talk about their current reality. They're going to say, hey, this is what is bugging me. This is what is keeping me awake at night. And this is a problem that I have. And the problem that the client has may be something like losing weight, for example, maybe writing a book, maybe building a relationship, maybe getting a promotion. And none of this is going to happen within that session. It's not a dream, it's not a vision, it's a clear goal that a client wants to accomplish. Losing a few kilos or getting a promotion or getting to build a relationship with somebody and so on. But it's not going to happen in the session. And therefore, in that session, what needs to happen is to drill down to what needs to happen. What is the client going to take away from that session? And that is what 3.1 is about. Till such time as you get to that point, the coaching conversation cannot really begin. And that's a contracting with the client as to specifically what needs to happen. So invariably what happens is, in order to reach that point, you may need to go through some of the other markers in this. What is important and what are the challenges in order to identify what specifically the client needs to achieve in that session. For example, if the client wants to get a promotion, it is not evident what is driving the client, motivating the client to reach that point. What is that aspirational value that is moving the client into that space? What is important or meaningful means that. So it may be very relevant to establish that in some way initially, and also what is likely to block the client. For instance, the client may seek a promotion because of status, because of building a relationship, because of some other aspirational value, maybe because of money. We don't know that. And the client, he or she may have challenges in terms of various things, in terms of the way they communicate, maybe some skill levels, whatever that might be. And it's important that these also be in a kind of a cyclical manner, not in a linear fashion, be covered. And then the coach is able to discuss with the client as to, okay, now that you have said, what is it that is aspirationally a value for you? And what is perhaps a limiting belief that you have in getting there? What is it that you would like to do in this session? What is it that you want to reach? And that question, 3.1, is going to be the more powerful one. Just saying, instead of just saying in the beginning, okay, what is it that you want to see as an outcome? And just picking it up there and running towards it. But the important thing to note is that once you have identified with the client, agreed with the client, and reconfirming with the client, what is it that the client really wants to achieve in that session in a granular, unambiguous manner, then you go back and establish how would the client feel once a client achieves that. It may not necessarily be some kind of an action plan. It may even be, the client says, I would like to have confidence in terms of being able to talk to my boss about getting a promotion. That's what I need to have by the end of that session. The confidence cannot be, in NLP terms, you cannot measure confidence, you cannot weigh confidence, you cannot scale confidence, but you can experience confidence. So you can ask the client, what happens at the end of the session when you have the confidence? How are you going to feel? So that we can now sort of establish what is that measure of success is going to be. And then after that goal has been established and the success measure has been established, you can once again go back and say, in addition to whatever you have said, is there anything else that you would like to add to whatever that is important for you in terms of doing this and therefore being able to arrive at your promotion, or other things that you would like to address? And 3.4 is a beautiful segue point into the larger exploration. Once these 4 are established, earlier there used to be 5 markers in CC2. The 5th one said about continuing in the way that the client wants to go, or tracking, that will still be relevant, that throughout the conversation, the coach keeps looking to the client to confirm whether they are traveling in the conversation together. Believe me, we, and those of you who are learning with us, you would know this. We believe in Coacharya based on our experience, Cindy and I, in training mastery level people. And we have produced directly in credentialing at least about 30 plus people, and individually we have mentored more than 50. We have found that unless you are able to establish this contract well, what is now CC3, what was earlier CC2, coaching cannot be meaningful. The rest of the conversation cannot take place. So even from an assessor's point of view, they would like to see you establish this. And a lot of the other competencies which follow in terms of trust, safety, presence, listening, awareness, etc., can actually be built into the questions as you are exploring these CC3 markers, 3.1 to 3.4. So we always tell our learners, at least spend about 10, 15 minutes in establishing this agreement. Establish the foundation first. And within that foundation, establish your relationship with the client. Establish the empathy, establish the partnership. Question about the emotions. Why is it this outcome that you want is emotionally important for you? What comes up for you in terms of when you think of experiencing what you wish to achieve? Many of these things can actually lead to very significant awareness and insights for the client as well. So I'll stop here for a minute to let Cindy comment on this, because I'm taking some time on this because we believe that the agreement, the contracting, the CC3 at this point in time is extraordinarily important. Unless you establish that the coaching conversation is of no value. Over to you, Cindy.
Absolutely. And you know, it's not because this word agreement is there. I like this word more. I like the words around you're establishing an agreement and the coaching process and the relationship with the client. You know, it's more than just one element here. And why I say that is right from the beginning of the session, when exploring the topic to clarify and expand on what is that goal or the outcome for the session, you're starting to build trust. You're establishing a connection with the client. It's going deeper. And there's all this partnering happening on different parts of what the client wants from the session, the desired outcome for the session. And that includes, as Ram was talking about, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and 3.4. What is it that the client considers is important for them as that constitutes an agreement for the session? And there's huge value in that, in the way other markers are related to it, meaning listening actively, create evoking awareness, and helping a client to pull through those pieces into the rest of the session, as in helping them manage the progress on what they wanted at the beginning of the session, or what they defined what they wanted from the beginning of the session. I think we've said enough on that one round. Let's do the next. Cultivate trust and unity.
So, and those of you who are training with us would probably already know this. The two structured frameworks or markers are really the CC3, which is about agreement, and action. The questions are very specific, and the markers need to be very specifically asked in order for those to be marked. Whereas all those which are in between is more like the process, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Trust, safety, presence, listening, and awareness. And these happen in the way that you partner with a client, the way that you listen, the way that you inquire. And we call this, for simplicity's sake, the LASI model: listening, acknowledging, sharing, and inquiring. And using an organizational development framework, which is called sensations, emotions, and thoughts. Many of these markers talk about, as 4.1 does, coach acknowledges and respects the talents, insights. Coach acknowledges and supports the client's expression of feeling, perceptions. Coach partners with the client. You will find a lot of these words being repeated. What do they mean? What does it mean when the marker says the coach acknowledges? What does the client feel when she is acknowledged? We're not talking about appreciation. We're not talking about many coaches who believe by saying, wow, that's great, fantastic, wonderful. That doesn't mean anything. Those are words you can avoid. That may be good on a coffee table conversation. In a coaching conversation, they have no place. Acknowledging happens when the client feels listened to. And think for yourself, when would the client feel that the client is being listened to? When you're able to repeat some of the words, the language the client has used. If the client talks about frustration, client talks about not being confident, the client talks about not feeling disempowered. And when the coach places it back to the client saying that as I listen to you, I hear you saying that you are frustrated or not confident or whatever else it is. That is what acknowledgement is about. Sometimes the acknowledgement is not just about the words, not about the verbal cues. It could be about the non-verbal cues. It could be a change in the voice tone, the way the client talks. Suddenly, the client becomes slow. The client sadness shows in the voice. The energy level drops, or it goes up. She gets motivated. So many of these things happen. So the listening and the acknowledging, the first two parts of the LASI model, L&A, are about acutely, empathetically, and as Otto Scharmer says, generatively listening to the client at the highest levels of listening capability, and then acknowledging what the client has said by using the client's words in that context, and then sharing with the client about what the coach notices. I see that what you're saying is so powerful in terms of your own strengths and the work that you're doing, or the feeling that you have. I see that I sense that perhaps you may be feeling a little overwhelmed, and leave it open so that the client, it's not about your judgment. The client can always come back and say, no, that's not what I'm feeling, it's something else. Or if the client uses a word which may have possibly different meanings for the client than what you think it is, when I hear you saying this, what exactly did you have in mind? And then perhaps inquire, saying, hey, what's going on within you? So putting these together, you will find that many of these markers that are in 4 and 5 can all be covered in terms of acknowledging and sharing with the client with respect and appreciation, the talents of the client, the insights of the client, what is coming up, the strengths of the client, what Sharma talks about as a generative. As you look at the client, you see the potential of the client to grow towards the outcome that the client wants to move to. In support with empathy, putting yourself as a coach in the shoes of that client or with concern, and observing not just the verbal cues in terms of what has been expressed, but also the non-verbal cues in terms of the feelings of the clients, some of the perceptions that the client has, maybe some belief system that is coming up, and then with partnering with the client in whatever way that the client says it's okay. So whatever you're stating, you're sharing with the client, always put it in a way that is open. Hey, this is what I sense. Perhaps it's right, perhaps it's not. So I would like you to share with me, how do you feel about this? What do you think about this? What needs to happen for you? So invite the client to disagree with you in a sense. You don't have to use the word every time that I don't necessarily want you to agree with me. You may once in a while say, may I have your permission to ask you this? And I'm stating this, but I would really like to have your opinion about this. These are multiple ways of how you can ask the client to respond to you without feeling that the client is being directed to do something. And then I'll move from there to presence, because these two are very much in tandem, maintaining presence. Earlier, there were 8 competencies. There were part of them were about what was happening in the, yeah, sorry, Cindy, yeah.
I just want to say something about, go back to 3, to 4.
Yeah.
Go back to 4, please.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you notice, as we just spoke about a few minutes ago, there's 3 of these 4 markers listed under embodies a coaching mindset. 1, 4.1, 4.3, and 4.4. And if you look at the words there, words used in these markers, you get a clear indicator of what happens or how the coach partners with the client, particularly with these words, acknowledges, respects, supports, partners. 4.1, 4.3, 4.4 are indicators for marking on embodies a coaching mindset. And especially look at 4.1 because there's some words here that were not in the current markers. These are updated words, right? And 4.1 talks about the coach acknowledges and respects the client's unique talents. And I guess it's, if you, maybe we should invite you to type into the chat box, or I think we would. Please feel free to type into the chat box what that means for you, acknowledging a client's unique talents, insights, and work in the coaching process. How would you acknowledge that? What are some indicators that will show up for you in the way you acknowledge the client's unique talents, insights, and work in the session? Go on, Ram. I just wanted to raise those points.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Cindy. Absolutely right. 4.1, 4.3, and 4.4 are referred to in the coaching mindset as those which evidence the coaching mindset as well. And these are all about partnering, exploring into the who of the mind of the client, or the emotions of the client, and so on. We really don't have time to go much greater depth in terms of defining each of these, and probably in future sessions, if you want us to address some of these. The LASI model that someone asked about is listen. A is for acknowledge or appreciate, acknowledge and appreciate. S is for share what the coach senses, and I is to inquire or explore, which is at a deeper level. because coaching is about exploring. It's about exploring the mind of the client for the client to reach towards outcome and to figure out the aspirational values that the client has in mind to move towards that. What are those limiting beliefs that are holding them back? And that's what the whole coaching process is about. The coaching process, in very, very simple terms, is a transition, a journey from a point A to point B, a point A in which the client is feeling disempowered, client is feeling uncomfortable, and the client wants to move to a better place. And that is a point B. And invariably, as we talk about the 3A model in Coach Area, that movement from A to B becomes difficult for the client, not because of external blocks, but very often because of internal blocks of limiting belief, unconscious incompetencies, interferences. And the first stage is creating that awareness. And the second stage is creating the action. And the third stage is creating the anchoring over multiple sessions. And this is what needs to happen. The first two, the awareness and action, happen in the session. And the anchoring happens through the journey. So some of the, acknowledging is a creative approach, acknowledging a creative approach by the client. It could be about a metaphor. It could be about something else that the client is sharing, a new insight that is coming up to the client at a point in time. Maybe to ask a little more to be explained about unique talents, if you notice them. Sure. Okay. The maintaining presence. Many master coaches would tell you that presence is one of the most important elements. I don't disagree with that, but it has to be combined with multiple other things. I think there is a lot in common now. The way ICF is redefining trust and safety, earlier it used to be called trust and intimacy. The safety is being included here because ultimately the coaching space needs to be a safe space. It needs to be a container where the client feels comfortable in terms of unpacking, in terms of opening up, in terms of expressing. And how do you do that? A part of it is done by the 4 factors which have been established here. And a part of it is also done by these 5 markers which come under presence as well, in terms of how the coach interacts with the client. If the actions of the client are in response to the whole person of the client, what's called the who of the client, the mind of the client, rather than just a situation, who are you dealing with? And that is really when the depth of coaching is reached, and that's when the transformation takes place. Because it's all, what is really holding the client back in a coaching conversation, in a coaching framework, is not some external element, a block that is happening out there, which perhaps can be pointed out to that by a mentor, a good friend, or someone older. But here we are really going into the mind of the client to understand, hey, what is really happening. And here, based on our own experience, we would find that 80% of the time, it's some kind of invalidation that holds us back. The invalidation creates a sense of insecurity, sometimes a fear of failure, a loss of confidence. And the invalidation happens as a result of past experiences. In coaching, you don't go into the depths of the past experiences. But if the client brings it up, you can always use that as a pattern to help the client to move forward. Based on whatever has happened in your past, what is it that needs to happen for you to move into the future to overcome that insecurity? By allowing the client to come and state that. So these are the nuances that need to be practiced by asking these who questions constantly, curiously, spontaneously, in context with what the client is saying, for you to be able to elicit information from the client. Coach acts in response to what the client wants to accomplish throughout the session. So keep that in mind. This what does not necessarily mean that you talk about whatever else is happening outside. It is still about what needs to happen within the session. And in order to move from the disempowered state to the empowered state, what needs to happen for the client? And you must still remember that this is being done with the client sitting in front of you. The client is not out in the field working out on his own. That may happen in between the sessions. So whatever you are doing has to happen within the mind of the client. So even this second 5.2 is really about exploring what the client would like to do to work on the current situation, the reality of what the client is facing, to be able to move forward. The third one, coach partners with the client by supporting the client to choose what happens. This is the client centricity. This is allowing the client to choose. The coach is not directing. So if all the coach's questions need to be open, there's no place for an either or question in coaching. Please remember that. Everything has to be an open question, and none of them leading. Questions that do not contain an answer that the coach is directing the client to. And the coach is curious into understanding what the client is thinking about, what the client is speaking about, what the client is feeling about, and also spontaneous. And as I mentioned earlier, the coach allows for silence, pause, or reflection. This is something that's very, very important, especially at the mastery level. In general, we say, speak for less than 30%, 20 to 30% if you're a coach. Allow the client to talk for 70 to 80%. So it's almost like you're watching the words that you say as if they're pearls of wisdom that are coming out there to evoke awareness in the client. Don't go paraphrasing what the client is saying. Learn how to succinctly compress what the client is saying, put it back into the client so that the client feels like expressing more about it by asking curious, spontaneous, open kind of questions. And as I said, count for 5 seconds before the client starts, from the time the client starts speaking before you open your mouth. And don't use words like, or kind of filler words, I know, you know, right, okay, or even They have no place in coaching because they detract from your own listening ability. You don't realize it. And some coaches would want to note down. It's terrible, believe you me. At mastery level, if we notice somebody saying that or noting that, immediately it creates a bias in the assessor's mind. And it reflects in your listening ability because you cannot write down and you cannot listen at the same time. And you're not going to tell the client, stop, I want to listen. It's more important for me to note down than to listen to you. It's the most stupid thing to do in a coaching conversation. So you have to learn to be able to listen and keep in mind what the client is saying. It doesn't matter if you forget. If it's really important to the client is going to repeat that. Don't worry about it. But whatever that you have listened to, at least the part that the client finishes with, at least start with that and open it up and see what you need to do. So one of the things that you need to develop is a complete focus, not multitasking, but unitasking of listening with total concentration, pausing, silent, and then without any inner dialogue, asking the client. And that is what leads you into mastery. If you don't do that, you're not going to really become a master level coach. Cindy?
Next, I want to pick up one point there, Ram, because we've heard it, I heard it very frequently in mentoring, and I'm sure you have too. 5.2, coach, but no, let me say this first. Sometimes when coaches think about presence, they think about it together with this word flow. And that's great, right? It's about the flow of the session. But they also think about it in terms of, I'm just going to flow wherever the client is going. But the flow of a session is linked to how the coach acts in response to what the client wanted to accomplish and make progress on in the session. That's what the flow is about. Flow is along what the client wanted to progress on in the session. A direct link to 5.2 and 5.1. So remember this about flow. And 5.1 is about the flow of coach responding to the whole person of the client. Meaning, like if there's an energy shift, coach responding to that, or a shift in tone, body language, feelings, coach is responding to the totality of the client. So just an alert point on what does flow mean with regards to presence for that session. You done, Ram?
Yeah. Yeah, Vinita made a point. It's a good one. 5.4 has moved from what used to be exhibiting curiosity to demonstrates. Yes, you will find that many of the languages or the words used here, the language, is about moving from the passive to the active, partnering, demonstrating, exploring, not merely something which is just passive in terms of how the client is, the coach is sharing with the client. So that is one of the things that we talk about in the LASI. S stands for sharing, sensing and sharing. Okay, CC6, which is about listens actively, which is pretty much the same as CC5 earlier, which is active listening, with some of them referring to not just listening, but also questions. The first one is about, it's about knowing who the client is, how the client is likely to behave, and the client situation and the who and so on. The second is about exploring the words that client uses, which the simplest way to do that is to acknowledge the client's statements by repeating the words or succinctly, precisely putting together the essence of what the client has said using the words of the client. You will find that the words, the language, etc., appear in multiple spaces. Inquires or explores about the client's emotions and feelings. We talked about that earlier, the energy shifts, the non-verbal cues. These are all part of the listening, observing, acknowledging, and sharing. When you notice these, you either inquire or explore. The words inquire and explore have different meanings. And inquire is maybe just ask, hey, what does this mean? What are you thinking about when you say that? Explore is at a deeper level, especially if it's about energy shifts, non-verbal cues, and whatever. You might want to go more into what I earlier talked about at the ACT, the sensations, emotions, and thoughts. You find something is happening there, the client is sounding sad or excited. So how does that feel for you in your body? What is the sensation that is coming up for you? And how would you label that as an emotion? What are the thoughts that are associated with that? That is an exploration. That's not merely an inquiry. So, and when it talks about inquires and explore, it's both. You are pointing out, asking a question, but also going into depth, how the client currently perceives themselves or their world. This is the systemic view of things in terms of, hey, this is what you see yourself as, and what is it that is happening outside there? How are you impacting other people? How is the rest of the world, other people you are working with, impacting you? So you can try and take it to a much larger systemic level, but still focus on the mind of the client. Allows the client to complete speaking without interrupting, which is an expansion of 5.5 earlier into 6.6. It doesn't mean that you cannot interrupt at all. Sometimes it may be necessary, especially if you have a time constraint, to be able to point out to the client, hey, look, we have agreed on a time limit. So a good way to start a conversation, you don't need to repeat the ICF confidentiality conditions. You're not expected to, even at ACC level now, certainly not at PCC and MCC. But what we would suggest to you is, after having certain sort of establishing a connection between the two, especially since coaching is supposed to be done with a regular client for assessment purposes, you might want to ask about something about what happened in the previous sessions, how have you done, etc. And then before you start with a 2.1 question, it's always good to ask the client, hey, how much time do we have together to partner? And let the client say that maybe you have pre-agreed 40 minutes, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever it is within the time frame. And then you can use that later if necessary. You know, we agreed on 40 minutes or 50 minutes. And now, you know, we haven't got much time left. So is that possible for you, or would you rather do something else? Leave the option open, but at least point out to the client that there is some amount of time pressure and therefore you are interrupting. And that is still permitted if you do it once in a while and if you do it with reason. And 6.7 is a new marker. Coach succinctly reflects or summarizes what the client communicated. It's very, very powerful. Earlier, in the original competency framework, there used to be something called paraphrasing, and which many coaches believe they gave them the right to expand one sentence the client says into 10 sentences. That's totally uncoach-like. Succinctly, briefly, concisely, precisely, summarizing it, putting it back into the client, that is what listening, acknowledging, and sharing is about. And then asking the client, okay, is that what you meant? If that is what you meant, what needs to happen now? And that really beautifully builds up a partnership. The constant interaction between the coach and the client in terms of partnering, sharing, and inquiring and exploring. Cindy? You're muted.
That's good, Ram. I think in the spirit of time, you continue.
Yeah, okay. So we have two more. I'll quickly do that. Vinita, when you summarize, do we still focus on keywords? Please always focus with the words of the client. Do not use different expressions. And that is not the creative part that coaching talks about. The creativity needs to be happening with the client. You are creating something within the client. It's not about you're trying and inventing new words. Because we have seen some coaches who like to use words, like some of you from India would know about Shashi Tharoor, that you have to look up in the dictionary to find out what the heck is going on. And that is not the purpose of coaching. It's much better if you use the word of the client, and very often even that word may not be very clear. So you can ask the client, this is what you said. What does that actually mean sometimes? So to answer to your question is, please focus on the key words of the client, the key emotional words of the client. Use exactly the words that the client is using, and then build your summary, etc. on that. Sorry, something happened now. Okay, what happened now? Sorry about that. Okay, my apologies.
By the way, I'll just jump in quickly, Ram. For those of you who aren't looking at chat, please add in any questions that you still have outstanding. So once we finish the session, I can grab all of those and I can get Ram and Cindy to answer them in writing. So please just feel free to add anything that's on your mind. And Ram, there's no need to answer them live.
Yeah, I'll answer this. If instead of taking notes, it's not instead of taking notes, please don't take notes, period, okay? If you want to really improve your coaching, don't take notes. If the client agrees to a video recording, that is for the purpose of the client, it's not for your purpose. Your taking notes is not for the client's purpose, your taking notes is for your purpose. If the client wants to take notes, that's perfectly fine. To ask the client to do that. Very often we tell clients when we work with them as coaches with the clients, we tell them, okay, you can jot down whatever you want. And then very often they bring the same notebook back and they journal in terms of what they have thought about, and then they come back with it, that's fine. Ask yourself this question again and again. What is the purpose of your doing what you're doing? Is it for your benefit or is it for the client's benefit? If the answer is that it's for your benefit, don't do it, please. Think about what it is for the client's benefit. What is the client centricity involved here? Okay, quickly into 7. 7 is pretty much the same as all the questions and some of the direct communication factors which were there in the previous competency. Given the time, I don't want to go too deep into this. We already see now numbers dropping here. So I don't think there is anything new here. It is about asking questions about the who, the thinking, feeling, about the situation, the what, about the outcome, pushing the client beyond what the client has talked about in terms of thinking, which is what allowing the client to create more. Here, things like metaphors and so on could be extraordinarily good. You can ask the client, is there a metaphor to express what you are thinking about rather than you're suggesting a metaphor? And then sharing observations, etc., without attachment, open-ended questions, and using language this is precise and concise, and allowing the client to do most of the talking. It's not merely 51-49 and the client coach feels very good. Oh, I have done only 49%. The client did 51%. We're really talking about substantially more talking. It could be 80-20, the client talking 80%, or 70-30 at worst, somewhere between 20 and 30%, not more than that. Try and practice that. That is what would allow you to get better at the craft. The last one, facilitating client growth, is the same as what used to be CC9, also CC8, which is awareness. The first three markers are picked up from the competency and PCC markers of awareness. It's the first one is about inviting the client to explore progress towards. It was there in CC9, also a little bit on CC8. 2 and 3 are very clearly from CC8, which were awareness. CC8 awareness before in the 9 markers. Now it is in CC8, facilitating client growth. And here, please be aware that this marker means that you ask a specific question, asking the client, what is it that you have learned about yourself? What is it that you have learned about your movement from what you were to what you wish to be? And they have to be positioned in that way. They have to be asked in that particular format. Otherwise, these markers are not going to be marked. The assessor is not going to assume, based on something the client said, that a coach has asked that question. Your assessment would not happen. It's not only out of the assessment. Sometimes it's possible the client may have their own insights which are coming up spontaneously. If that happens, it's fantastic. But even then, you can support that by observing that, sharing it. What more can happen? Cindy always says, in the earlier competency of CC8, don't stop assuming that awareness has happened, asking the client to summarize what are your insights. Always keep asking, is there anything more that needs to happen? Is there something that is beyond the outcome that you're looking for now in this session that could be of use in your work or life in future? Those are the questions which could be tremendously valuable to the client. So please expand yourself more in this space. And then the remaining 8.5 onwards, 8.4 is also 8.2, 3, and 4 are primarily from the earlier CC on awareness. And from 8.5 onwards, these are pretty much what used to be in the earlier action. What is it the client wants to do after the session in terms of action? And how would the client want to move forward? What could be potential blocks? And what are the support systems that are required? And how does the client establish activity? One of the things I would like you all to consider is to look back into CC3, which is about agreement, and how beautifully you can link those questions of the markers of agreement with that of action. For example, when we earlier talked about the potential challenges and things that need to be addressed, here during action, you are coming back to the same space, but in terms of the action. Similarly, when earlier we talked about the importance, which is about the motivation of the client, you're asking about the accountability, that you came to this particular outcome with a tremendous amount of motivation. So what is it that would keep you going? What is it that makes sure that whatever that you wanted with so much of motivation to be able to get it done for you? And then finally, celebrating the client's progress and learning. Earlier, it was not a word celebrate, it was not that active as the word celebrate is. So point out to the client specifically, this is what has happened during the session. I see that you have made such wonderful progress. Now, how would you like to appreciate yourself could be a question that you would want to end up with. And finally, completing the session. If you notice, those of you who are more well-versed in your markers, earlier, the position of the 8.8 and 8.9 were reversed in the previous markers. 9.5 was about closing the session. 9.6 was about observing the client's progress and learning. Now it is much more structured, sensible in that sense. And partnering with the client, how you want to complete the session doesn't mean, okay, we are stopping the recording now. Please don't ever do that. Very gently ask the client's permission. Have we completed whatever you wanted? And somewhere in the competency framework, it says, honoring the client for the session. So with great respect, honor the client, the experience that you've had, and very gently, very politely, very respectfully ask the client, hey, is it fine that whatever that you want to do now, can we close? Or is there something else that you want to think about? Or is there something else that we can carry on forward in the next session? Maybe in terms of even planning the next session. So do it very respectfully, partnering with the client. So I'll stop here. Cindy, if you can wrap up and then we can close.
Okay. If there are questions, as Magda has said, we will answer them and create a blog out of them. For Cotaria learners on the call, we are also going to break this down into manageable pieces in the LMS. What else do I want to say? And Ram and I, from time to time, are going to pick this up and talk about it in more meaningful ways, with direct context to mentoring, sharpening your skill set, and with the context to credentialing. And we'll start doing that early next year. Thank you all for attending and being a part of this webinar.
Yeah, just to put it this way, sorry. The reason Magda asked you to put down all the questions, we will keep these questions in future learning webinars, we will address them. Some of the things Karen has asked about, what options, how do you want students to practice? It's going to be a very, very long answer. I think we would need an entire session to be able to tell you, if you are a trainer, how we do that, how we work with our trainers. Rajesh, direct question, I don't think we ever talked about direct question. We talked about direct communication. The question need not be direct or directive. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by it. We will talk about it later. If at this stage the client chooses to set a goal for the subsequent session, I mean, very gently suggest to the client, in terms of the time that we agreed, is that okay, that we do it in the next session? When we meet again, whatever time, please bring it up. That's probably the best word. So one of the things that I would really request you to avoid, towards the end of the session, don't ask the client, is there anything more that you want to explore? There's nothing worse than that, because it's going to open up a can of worms. Okay, so please don't ever do that. Try to focus in the last generally we would structure the sessions for about maybe 15, 17 minutes on agreement, maybe about 20 odd minutes on exploration, 30 to 40 minutes, and another 10 minutes to wind down. During that period, collect the insights, move into action, and then plan the next session if you wish to. But please do not ask the client at that point in time. Just like I said, don't say, can I switch off the recording? Or don't ask the same way, what more would you like to explore? Please don't. Thank you. Thanks, Cindy. Take care.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us in this session. We shall meet you in the next learning webinar or any of the other advanced webinars and so on. Take care. Bye-bye.